Hey guys, we are live coming from Dodgertown, Los Angeles, reaching across the country to New York. James Kaplan, special guest with us.
New
And
York, or Greg, as it's now known, Mudville.
I was going to use the Mudville joke, but I figured that would be corny.
Beat
But
you to it.
thank you for. and I was up late last night watching the game and didn't get a chance to work on all my promotional stuff till late. But anyway, James Kaplan is a nationally known author who's written several wonderful books, including two on Frank Sinatra, one on Irving Berlin, novels, and you've been in every major magazine, Vanity Fair, New Yorker, etc. But this right here is his latest book, just came out this year, Three Shades of Blue, Miles Coltrane, Bill Evans, and the Lost Empire of Cool. And it is really the story of ostensibly kind of blue, but it isn't. Did I say welcome? Welcome, James. Thanks for joining us
Thank you,
from New
Greg.
York.
I'm delighted to be here and
Thank
delighted
you
to be
very
talking
much.
with you.
Great that I was able to get you to agree to come on my little channel here in the dark corner of the internet. But I have thousands of buddies and viewers who are vinyl record collectors and jazz freaks, and I think this is an important book for them to get a hold of.
Hey, let me ask you quickly: Do you
Yes,
know of a young man named Matthew Fat Cat Rivera?
I'm not sure I do. Is he a vinyl YouTube guy or what is he?
He is not. I don't know if he's a YouTube guy, but he is. He does a show on WKCR, which is the Columbia University radio station,
NPR,
and
right?
it's a great. It has been for a long time, KCR, a great haven for jazz. There was for many years a DJ named Phil Shapp, both famous, infamous, and kind of immortal for knowing every molecular particle of every jazz occurrence there ever was. He died a couple of years ago. Matthew Fat Cat Rivera, I can't say exactly inherits the mantle because he's a very different kind of broadcaster, but he is a great collector of vinyl, and he does these shows in New York, downtown in New York, where he has these get-togethers where they play a lot of old vinyl. He's very knowledgeable, but he doesn't flaunt the knowledge. He presents it with a kind of shy and beautiful discretion, and I'm a big fan of his.
Phil Shapp.
Yeah, Phil Shapp. Phil Shapp was the guy we no longer have with us.
Two
Matthew
guys.
Fat Cat
Matthew Rivera
is the vinyl maven.
Okay, great promo for Matthew Rivera. We'll check him out.
Yeah, please do.
Maybe he'll be on my show someday. Maybe I'll
He
be on
should
his show.
be.
Maybe we'll just snark at each other. Who knows? So this book ostensibly is the story of Kind of Blue, but it's really much more than that. To me, it's three intertwining biographies of three great guys, and Kind of Blue is kind of the center point or the pinnacle, if you will. But that's my intro. That's not the question. The question is, you got to interview Miles Davis.
Yeah.
Years before you knew that this would turn into a book. That was just a magazine piece, Vanity Fair or something. Tell us about it.
Yeah, it was a magazine. It was a Vanity Fair profile in 1989, and it ran in conjunction with an excerpt from Miles's autobiography, written with Quincy Troop, which is a whole other subject, but it was just being published then. So I wrote a little piece, not that little. I interviewed Miles for a piece to accompany the excerpt from Miles's memoir, and it was extraordinary good luck that I chanced into this assignment, and it was a terrifying and edifying and beautiful couple of sessions with Miles Davis. For me, somebody who purported to know about jazz, but actually at that point in my life knew next to nothing about jazz.
Yeah, that was at his New York apartment or something like that.
It was for whatever reason he had left the brownstone he had owned for years on the Upper West Side, He was no longer married, I think, to Cicely Tyson. He was living in a suite at the Essex House on Central Park South. And I found him in fine fettle, wearing a huge brown curly wig, which he kept spritzing with a little atomizer. Uh, uh, Go figure. It was Miles. Miles doesn't have to explain himself, but I was terrified, rightfully so, because I knew nothing, but also because Miles's reputation had preceded him. Miles was the Prince of Darkness, and Miles terrified a lot of people. He was said not to like white people. A lot of things were said about Miles. And of course, when you actually meet somebody, it's totally different from what you expect, as Miles was. And he was a pussycat. He could not have been kinder and more welcoming to me. And I loved spending time with him, even though my today self kicks my 1989 self for being so ignorant. When I listen to I recorded our sessions, our interviews, and when I look at the transcript, I kick myself for not having asked this, that, or the other thing. But the point is, I got to spend a lot of time with him, and he was generous, and it did prove to be the foundation for what turned out to be this book I wrote.
Well, and maybe the time in his life when you got to meet him, when he was maybe a point of being a little more self-reflective and looking back, and that was a point in his life where he had already been through a lot of stuff. I'm just trying
to put it mildly. Yes, he'd been through a lot. Miles had been through a lot of stuff in 1980.
Maybe it calmed down a little bit and was maybe a little more open to selling books, for one thing, because he sounded like he needed the money.
Yeah. Yes, I think all of the above is true.
And he and Bill spent a lot of time trying to earn enough money to handle their drug habits, but we'll get into that a little later. So you came at this book not as a jazz freak per se, not an all-knowing jazz person, where a lot of jazz books are written by those type of people. The fact that you came at it as a writer, I mean, I think the writing is wonderful.
Thank you.
And there are many passages in it that I love and wanted to underline, but I didn't keep a pen near the bed. But the point is, it's not a jazz nerd book as so much as it's a beautifully written book. One line I'm just going to try to remember off the top of my head has to do with the fact that when the Kind of Blue album came out, it didn't really make a big splash. And your line, it was like a pebble thrown into a pond,
at first,
slowly radiating ripples that spread out into the jazz world.
Yeah, a lot of people were nonplussed by that album when it came out. They didn't quite know what to make of it. It seemed very subdued to some people, too quiet to some people. But there were a couple of highly intelligent critics who saw it for what it was, which was monumental, groundbreaking, historic, and timeless.
And it's hard to make sense of it in language without hearing it, and hopefully everybody's heard it by now.
Yeah.
But it is a great way for somebody who says, "Oh, I don't know anything about jazz. I don't think I like it," and then you throw that on, and people who like rap or rock or country say, "Oh, I think I get it now."
Yeah.
And that's one of the powers of this record.
Yeah.
But again, the book is not so much about the album; it's about what went into the album, the stories of these three geniuses.
Right.
One reviewer said there's a fourth. Well, I don't want to get into that yet. There's two other people that almost could have been on the cover, maybe three people, and that's Charlie Parker, Monk, and Dizzy.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned somewhere else that you had a few pages of those people that didn't make it in there.
More than a few. More than a few.
I wouldn't have minded if the book was a few pages longer.
Well, it's kind of you to say, but I didn't want anybody to hurt themselves carrying it around.
Well, not everybody, I do get a little intimidated by anything over 300 pages. So I get it.
Yeah.
But the influence of those men on the people is really a great, fascinating part of this story. how Miles interacted with Charlie Parker.
Yeah,
Tell
and
us about
yes,
either that or Coltrane and Monk. Tell us about either of those
yeah. No, those
influences.
there were all fascinating relationships. I have always found myself fascinated by the relationship between Miles and Monk, because when Miles began to play around midnight, he got. Sorry about this. I have an eager friend who is texting me, and I wish I can't turn off the sound of that text. Anyway, uh, Monk was sort of worked up. He got sort of annoyed at Miles because he said you're not playing it right. You ain't playing it right. And he wasn't. Miles, for all his genius ear, could not quite. Round Midnight is a complicated song. It's a complicated piece of music. And I'm a decent living room pianist with a pretty good ear. And I can sit down and figure out a Beatles song or The Best Is Yet to Come, a Sinatra song. But to sit down and figure out the changes for Around Midnight is not an easy matter for anyone. And even for Miles, it wasn't. So it took him a while to learn it. That was an amazing relationship. And of course, Miles famously fired Coltrane shortly after hiring him because Coltrane was still a heroin addict. And what does Coltrane do? But he goes down to the 5 spot with Monk, and has in the summer of 1957 this. I hate to, the word legendary is such a tired, beaten old horse, but there's no other way to put it. There is this stand at the 5 spot in the summer of 57 that is just, it's beyond great. It is Coltrane and Monk at the peak of their powers and playing so beautifully together. And Miles had to come by and see what was going on, and he hires Coltrane back. And
Yes,
a lot of the reason for that was that by that point, Coltrane had kicked heroin, not alcohol or candy, but he had kicked heroin.
And they had to extend that session. It started out as, I think, a 2-week, and then they just extended it.
Yeah,
And
2 week
stand,
stand, and then it turned
everybody
into.
was coming down to check it out, and Miles was like, I want my player back. You stole my sax player."
Yeah.
You mentioned Coltrane's addiction to sweets. This is just kind of a off-topic aside, but the famous picture. That's true. We'll be giving away some in a bit here. The famous picture of Blue Train, John Coltrane. I don't know if you know the story there.
No.
He's very pensive there.
Yeah.
I can get the record 2 seconds.
Yeah, please.
Right here. But maybe it's not right here. Where did I put it? Oh, shoot. Yep, I got it. I got a 19. I have a second U.S. pressing that I got for $5. Everyone thinks he's very pensive.
Yeah.
But if you look at the contact sheet of all the shots,
yeah,
he's sucking on a lollipop.
Ah.
So his addiction to sweets.
Yeah, there you go.
Teeth. That's just a funny piece of.
There you go. Poor Coltrane.
Trivia.
He was a sad man. He had a lot of loss in his life, and he was deeply affected by it. And he self-medicated, as did Evans, as did Miles.
Alice. I don't know if John was here or not, but Alice, when he married Alice, they lived a few blocks from here in Los Angeles, and their sons went to the same high school that my son went to.
Ah.
And not everybody knows that John Coltrane Jr. was killed in a car accident as a teenager, as a high school senior, and so that's happened just a few miles from. So, just to add to all the horrible things that happened to Coltrane, not everyone knows that because his son. Anyway, let me go through. So I'm somebody who I get on these live streams with people and I argue about stuff. And one thing I'm fond of saying is Miles is the most important and influential musician of the 20th century. Yeah. Not everyone agrees with that. Some people want to say it's Charlie Parker. But can you put in words what made him great or greater?
Well,
Not just his
there's
fingers and
no
his playing, but the whole thing.
yeah, there's no originality in saying this, but Miles was really the Pablo Picasso of jazz, certainly, and of music in general in a lot of ways in the 20th century. He was constantly shape shifting, sort of terminally impatient artistically, even after he had turned out this historic album Kind of Blue, he was very resistant afterwards to playing the music from it, and after a short time stopped playing the music from Kind of Blue altogether. He said that going back to it would be like eating leftover turkey, and Miles felt that way about every genre, every variety of jazz he went through, from the moment he alit in New York City in 1944 as an 18-year-old at Juilliard, to the end of his life in 1991. He picked up every bright stone, every shiny object in the field of jazz and examined it, and then went into it and changed it for the better, and then went on to the next thing. He was, nobody denies that he was a great artist, but he was a great artist who, unlike almost every artist, a great artist you can think of in jazz, was so variable and so exploratory. And you can take these other geniuses like Duke Ellington, like Louis Armstrong, like Diz and Bird, and you could certainly argue about Duke Ellington, that he went through a lot of phases and discovered a lot of things. But I think Miles's trajectory was longer and more varied.
And he was very restless. He was never satisfied.
Yeah.
He always pushed forward. Once he delved into a style, he ran it through in 2 or 3 years and moved on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Where so many artists are going to just play their greatest hits over and over and over for 40 years. So,
yeah. And people have made that argument about Evans. People say that Evans he did the same trio, piano, bass, drums until the end of his life.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, and this is a slight tangent, but when I interviewed the wonderful John Baptiste for my book, Baptiste made the argument that, and maybe he was being a little perverse, I'm not sure, the argument that Evans perhaps went further than Miles or Coltrane, and he adduced as evidence of this Evans's album where he plays along with himself.
Conversations with Myself.
Yeah, Conversations with Myself.
Yeah, I remember reading that part in the book, and basically saying he goes deeper.
Goes
whatever
deeper.
he's going.
I thought that was an interesting statement. I think that John Baptiste is a brilliant artist in his own right, something very close to a genius, if not a genius. And I love everything he does. I'm not sure he was right about Evans in this. I think that and Conversations with Myself, to me, it's not my favorite Evans album. To me, it can sound overworked and busy a lot of the time. I'd rather just hear him play solo.
One Evans is all you need, perhaps.
Yeah.
I have two. Great. So let's see. So, I guess it's time to get a little bit to the dark side here. One of the reviews I read of your book said there's really 4 stars in this book. The 4th one being heroin.
Yeah.
And that the whole, what I would call the 3rd act of the book is, I guess, alludes to the title, The Lost Empire of Cool. At first, that title didn't make sense to me. I said, okay, it's over, but it's really a sad devolution, I think you used the term. Tell us about that portion of the story, whether it's heroin or whether it's the downfall of these two or three great guys?
Well, it's not just two or three great guys. It is in the chapter in the book where I write about heroin. I have a sort of terrible roll call or continuing roster of jazz musicians who died young or incredibly young, basically from the life. So when you have somebody like Bunny Berrigan, who was a terminal alcoholic, you have somebody whose life and whose end was just as sad as, say, Dick Twardzik or so many of the young greats that made jazz in the post-war period such a beautiful thing, but sacrificed themselves on this altar, on this false altar of heroin. And the original sin really went back to Bird. It went back to this spectacular emergence of this incomparable genius, Charlie Parker from Kansas City, who was not only monumental alto saxophonist, but a monumental heroin addict, and who actually tried to warn young musicians away from the drug. He said, as long as you keep putting it in your nose, you can be a gentleman, but the moment you stick it into your arm, it owns you, or words to that effect. And it was horribly true, but it wasn't listened to by this whole complement of young artists who felt that if you want to play like Bird, you have to do like Bird. If you want to be cool, you have to inject heroin. And Miles fell for it, and Coltrane fell for it, and certainly Bill Evans fell for it. And it killed them all. It killed all three of them ultimately. Miles lasted until age 65, and you could make the argument that there were many things that made Miles a very, very old and sick 65 when he died. But it was a blight. It was a huge blight on jazz, and yet, it's important to understand that here I sit. A white man on in years who is writing at a comfortable distance about these things. And when I spoke to the great Sonny Rollins, he said something that brought me up short and that I didn't entirely understand at the moment he said it, but that reverberated more and more for me the longer I thought about it. And Sonny Rollins, who himself was a heroin addict and who had to go to the federal correctional facility in Lexington, Kentucky to kick the drug, and stayed off of it and remains with us to this day. But Sonny Rollins did not make some speech excoriating Bird and heroin users or decrying heroin. Rather, he said to me, drugs were really our form of rebellion. Our, meaning Black jazz musicians in the 1950s, our form of rebellion against white society. And when you look at straight white society in the Eisenhower years, when you look at the things that happened to Art Blakey when he was playing in Georgia, got pulled over driving, as Art Blakey said, was arrested for being a Negro. And this cracker policeman beats Art Blakey so severely over the head with his baton, probably for not being subservient enough, so badly that Art Blakey had to have a steel plate put in his skull. When Miles Davis in August of 1959, the very month in which Kinda Blue is released, Miles is playing Birdland on Broadway in New York City. He's taking a break. He's standing outside talking to a young woman. And you can't call the cop a cracker. I'm not sure what you can call him, but he was certainly white. Sees Miles Davis standing there talking to a young white woman, feels kind of annoyed by it, And despite the fact that Miles Davis is headlining at the Birdland, and there's a big poster right there with his name and picture on it, the young cop orders Miles Davis to move along. And when Miles doesn't move along, the policeman takes his baton and, as he feels is his right, beats Miles Davis, the great genius of jazz and of American music and of art in the 20th century, beats him bloody. And there are many photographs of Miles with blood all over his summer suit and his white shirt. It's a horrible, horrible thing. So when Sonny Rollins was saying that heroin was our form of rebellion, this white person begins to understand what he was talking about. And as horrible as the results were, there was something to this in the 1950s, and something to, as terrible as it was, something to being cool and playing on heroin. Randy Brecker, the wonderful trumpeter who I was fortunate enough to interview for the book, told me that he didn't sit there. He used heroin for a while, and certainly his late brother Michael Brecker arguably died from it as well.
I didn't know Michael was a user also.
Oh, Michael was an addict, and Michael died from cancer. But who's to say what what might have happened had Michael Brecker not used heroin? I'm not sure. Yeah. But Randy Brecker would not. He didn't give me a diatribe about heroin. He just told me about how you could feel wonderful when playing on heroin, and you could play a little bit behind the beat. There was something that Randy Brecker called junkie time. And junkie time doesn't mean the era in which a lot of jazz musicians used heroin. It meant, in Randy Brecker's formulation, the tempo, this particular tempo that when you're on heroin and when you're playing whatever instrument it happens to be, lets you lag just a little bit behind the beat, and it produces that beautiful, hard to say beautiful and heroin in the same sentence, but produces that beautiful sense of suspense and of mystery when the musicians are lagging just that little bit behind the beat. So a horrible, horrible thing, horrible period in American history when young jazz musicians felt that in order to approach the genius of Charlie Parker, they had to inject heroin. And when young jazz musicians felt that in order to rebel against straight white Eisenhower society, they had to use heroin, and produced so much great music and died so young.
Two quick comments to that. The greatest proponent of behind the time in popular culture is, of course, Sinatra, who's been the subject of your two books. Yeah. I don't know if there's any evidence. I have no idea if he used heroin or not.
No. He used alcohol.
I'm just saying he got to the behind the time playing a different way, but
he got to it through his own genius. I mean, Sinatra was a musical genius, certainly on a par with Miles. Mm-hmm. They encountered each other several times, and they respected each other a great deal, respected each other's work a great deal. Sinatra came up with it.
Maybe naturally.
Came up with it himself, and without sticking a spike into his vein.
I thought Charlie Parker's use of heroin was because he had a debilitating car accident and broke a bunch of bones in his back, and he was in horrible pain. In other words, he had a legitimate need for painkiller all the time, and maybe that message got lost among people who took it up for other reasons. Was that car accident early enough in his career that it is a cause for him to be using it constantly, or am I off on my timing?
I think you're off on the timing. Okay. I don't know. I don't know much about that accident. I do know that Charlie Parker started using heroin very, very young. I don't know when the accident happened. Car accidents certainly lost us a number of great artists from Scott LaFaro to Clifford Brown, whose birthday was yesterday. But I think Charlie Parker just felt he tried it. It was heroin until World War II. The drug of choice among jazz artists was primarily marijuana, or drugs were marijuana and alcohol with a side dish of cocaine sometimes, but mostly marijuana and alcohol. But World War II and its aftermath brought a lot of heroin to these shores, brought by organized crime. And, Dexter Gordon put it very eloquently, and I can't do anything but paraphrase. The quote is in my book, but he said, "When you're young, and there's a lot of sadness, and a lot of loneliness, and a lot of temptations when you're playing jazz in clubs and touring as a young jazz musician, and heroin very easily filled that gap for a lot of young musicians." And certainly filled it for Charlie Parker. Not just the loneliness, not just the sadness of being an underpaid jazz musician and going from club to club, but the temptations and the pushers. There were a lot of pushers frequenting a lot of those clubs, and Bird, like others, succumbed to it. I don't know about physical pain. I know that Miles had a huge amount of physical pain almost his entire life, whether it was sickle cell, whether it was his hips, a botched hip replacement, his liver, all kinds of pain that he suffered through, and he self-medicated. After he stopped using heroin, he self-medicated with alcohol and cocaine, so which didn't do his liver any favors either.
I read that Miles said that he started heroin in New York as an antidepressant.
Yes, this was after returning from France in 1949.
He was alone in the biggest city in the world, didn't know anybody, and he was depressed, and that healed that pain, a different kind of pain.
Well, it was a little bit more than that. It was the fact that he had gone to Paris in 1949. He's 22, 23 years old, spring of 1949, with some jazz all-stars. And they played some great concerts over there. And it was the first time Miles had been overseas. And here he is in France in 1949, suddenly encountering people who don't treat him as subhuman, as a second-class citizen, as 3/5 of a human being. They treat him directly, face to face, as another human. And he falls, he falls in love in Paris in the spring of night. What could be better? Paris in the spring, he falls in love with this gorgeous young French singer, Juliette Greco. But then he has to come home. And he comes back to a place where he's just another black man, and where he is figuratively and literally spat upon. And he's so depressed by this homecoming that he starts using heroin. And for the next 5 years, it bedevils him and belittles him and diminishes him. He desperately wanted to be signed to Columbia Records, because Columbia was one of the two biggest labels in America and in the world at that point, along with RCA. And George Avakian, the head of jazz A&R at Columbia, wouldn't sign him. He didn't want a heroin addict. Miles was dirty. He was disheveled. He was married. He was married to that needle. And Avakian never had any need for him or desire for him until Miles had kicked.
We have a question from the audience, which was a question that was on my list anyway. I was discussing the book with my wife, and I was telling her about the death of Bill Evans, and she asked the obvious question: Were these artists great in spite of or because of? And did Miles or other artists think that they were actually getting an artistic boost, or was it separate from their art?
Yeah, I think in
They could have
Miles's
collected that.
case, heroin was more a compensation, an antidepressant, a refuge than a source of inspiration. I think that in the case, I think this applies similarly to Coltrane. With Evans, the story's a little more complicated because Evans enters Miles's band in 1958 as this nerd from New Jersey. Here he is, he looks like some guy who teaches, I don't know, who teaches maybe economics or
He has a slide rule in his pocket.
or math at a he looks like a college teacher or maybe a high school teacher. He's got his glasses and he's very pale skinned. And Miles starts hazing as greatly as Miles admired Evans.
Talking about the nerdy Bill Evans.
Well, no, see that's the interesting thing about Evans. Yeah, there are much nerdier pictures of Evans.
Well, but this is the one I happen to have behind me.
What Evans does when he joins Miles's band, and it's a form of is it a form of protective coloration? It's a form of conformity in a certain way. He wants to blend in more. He is it's Chick Corea, who I was also fortunate enough to interview for my book. And boy, was he a great man, Chick Corea. So beautiful, so intelligent, so thoughtful. I thought I was going to have problems with Chick Corea because of Scientology, and I couldn't detect a trace of Scientology. I'm sorry, I'm digressing. I'm trying to address the question. But Chick Corea talked about going to a club in Boston when Corea was 17 years old, snuck in pretending to be 18, and sitting down in front, he and his friend are going to see Miles, and the sextet filters out onto the stage, and there's John Coltrane, and there is I guess at that point probably Philly Joe Jones, and there is Miles himself. And he said, Chick Corea told me that suddenly this white guy with glasses sits down at the piano, and I don't know if I'm allowed to use curse words on your show, but Chick Corea says, I'll modify it. Chick Corea said, I was so effing disappointed. And a lot of people were, just at the sight of Bill Evans playing the piano in the greatest small jazz band in America at the time. A lot of Black audiences were incensed. A lot of Black musicians were incensed at the existence of Bill Evans. And Bill Evans's form of self-defense, in a way, was to turn himself into the biggest junkie in Miles's band. And so that was his story. I don't think that for Evans, drugs were about inspiration. Certainly cocaine, which he turned to after he switched from heroin to methadone, cocaine, which Bill Evans injected into every conceivable part of his body. I think cocaine only distorted and vitiated Evans's gorgeous touch and his great technique. It made him speed up tempos. It made him play less well. So, maybe it was an inspiration for some musicians, not for the three heroes of my book.
And even if it was an inspiration, it didn't necessarily make them better. They may have mentally thought it, but
I think it was something else for those three guys.
Yeah. You didn't mention in the book the famous story. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but Bill Evans, between sets, goes out into the alley, shoots some dope, comes back, sits at the piano, and somebody says, "Hey, Bill, there's a needle in your arm still." He starts playing with the needle. I didn't realize, you pointed out in the book, that Bill was left-handed, so he was injecting from his left hand into his right hand, and by the end of his career, he had really screwed up the nerves in his right hand, which is a horrible shame. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge a bunch of new viewers that we've gotten the last few minutes because, as I mentioned
Please.
before,
Delighted you're here.
my friend Rachel, who runs the biggest vinyl community stream show every single morning, they just left there at 9 o'clock, and a dozen or so came over to visit us. So just to recap, guys, for those of you that just joined us, we're talking to James Kaplan, the author of this wonderful book, 3 Shades of Blue, Miles Coltrane, Bill Evans. Add it to your holiday shopping list. And we've just gone through several decades of jazz history with James.
It makes a great gift.
It does. And I've got a lot of heavy duty jazz fans here. It costs about as much as a jazz record does these days.
There you go.
You know, these records are now $30-40. Let's ask the question. 1959 somehow became possibly the pinnacle of jazz recording. We had Kind of Blue, Time Out, Mingus, the Ornette album, Giant Steps was being recorded.
Yeah.
I always thought that year was a launching point, but the book, at least some people say, well, it was the pinnacle or the beginning of the end of jazz. Because,
well, I listen, I wouldn't necessarily call it the beginning of the end of jazz, because so much great jazz got produced in the early and middle 60s. But of course, the early and middle 60s, when rock and roll, which everybody left for dead when Elvis joined the army, rock and roll comes raging back, and particularly on the night of February 9th, 1964, when these 4 young lads from Liverpool appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. And the next morning, February 10th, 1964, every teenage boy in America, that's an exaggeration, but a lot of them who had been straining mightily to learn how to play trumpet or saxophone, every teenage boy in America goes out and buys an electric guitar, and all you need is 3 chords. Rock and roll in the early and mid and late 60s and onward really hit jazz like a neutron bomb, and it completely depopulated the audience for jazz, and there was never any coming back from that. Jazz continued to develop in a lot of interesting ways, but another person whose testimony I relied on for my book, the wonderful trumpeter Nicholas Payton, wrote an amazing sort of screed in 2011, I think it was, called "On Why Jazz Isn't Cool Anymore." Forgive me if I'm getting that title slightly wrong, but he makes some very powerful points, and one of which is jazz separated itself from popular music in 1959. And he says, Nicholas Payton, big mistake. So the audience for jazz, and jazz does many wonderful things after 1959. And of course, Miles has his second great quintet after 1959, and so much is done, so much artistically wonderful and brilliant is done by so many great artists in the 60s and 70s and 80s and onward in jazz. But the audience, America turns into, it explodes into a shower of bright particles that become 1,000 tribes. We have become 1,000 tribes in America. Certainly culturally, this is true. And jazz became a niche music and remains so today. I won't say anything against all the great artists playing jazz today, but I will say that the clubs aren't there anymore, and that most of the jazz that's produced in America, at least these days, comes out of the academies, comes out of jazz colleges and universities that have jazz programs, and these wonderful young musicians emerge from these programs. And where do they go? Well, I guess the most they can hope for in a lot of ways, if lightning doesn't strike them and they become able to make a living from their music, they go back into the academy. And so jazz is sort of
teaching. Yeah, but it also creates an academic style of jazz that is designed by academics for academics.
Yes, and talk about paradox, right? Talk about the paradox of heroin. Talk about the paradox of the internet and jazz, right? Because on the one hand, anybody wanting to play jazz these days can hear anybody else playing jazz. And so there's a lot of kind of sanding down of styles, of homogenization of styles. When in the old days, the old codger said, but back in the 1930s and 1940s, there was Kansas City jazz, Chicago jazz, Detroit jazz, Los Angeles jazz, New Orleans jazz, and then New York jazz. And all these different styles and all this cross fertilization, and it was very productive, this cross fertilization. So what you have now is you have this homogenization that's going on, but the paradox is that what is coming into jazz in a great way these days is a cross fertilization, and the influence of so many different kinds of world music on jazz today, from hip hop to African music, world music. It all comes together in jazz now, and you can hear so many cultural strains in jazz today that you could not before the internet. So there are these two factors sort of working against each other, and again, the sort of isolation of jazz and the jazz audience into this niche. It's vital, but it is smaller than it used to be.
Well, yeah, the club scene that evolved in the 30s, 40s, 50s was so amazing, and just the economics of that has fallen apart. Even a city like Los Angeles, we've got a couple jazz clubs, but it's nothing like the scene where you had guys coming together
Central Avenue,
fertilizing each other. You know, there were just, okay, I've got somebody putting some junk on my thing here. Anyway, I want to acknowledge some of the comments here. This person read the book, Belisario. Thank you. It's a great comment.
Thank you to Belisario. Thank you.
And then my friend Tom, who's a New York guitar player and bass player. Well, Kamasi Washington, of course, from LA here. Is a big proponent of spiritual and African beats and all that stuff. Great player.
Yeah.
I don't know Steve Lehman. I was going to mention Shabaka Hutchins also. I've got somebody dumping some junk in my Rachel, help me do this. Anyway, let's get back to the word you used at the very end of the book was the phrase was jazz is devolving into esotericism.
Yeah.
I never heard that word before.
Well, maybe I made it up. I don't know, Greg.
But I get it. I listen to some of the most esoteric, the free jazz, the Archie Shepp, the Cecil Taylor, and the neighbors just run away when they hear those needles hit the vinyl. And it's jazz only makes up less than 2% of new record sales. Yet it's a very passionate crowd of listeners. So it is a paradox in many ways that the greatest American art form is becoming unknown. Kids today don't know it. The academies are full of white kids.
Yeah,
not black kids.
But at the same time, and just replying further to Tom Shedd, yes, let's acknowledge Kamasi. Let's acknowledge Steve Lehman. Let's acknowledge Robert Glasper and Esperanza Spalding and Jazz Maya and Samara Joy and Aaron Deal and the great, great Cecilia McLaurin Salvant, who can sing like nobody's business and is arguably every bit as great as Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday. So many wonderful young artists, and we're richer for the fact that they are with us and they need to be acknowledged. And but at the same time, there is a sadness at the contraction of the art.
I feel like guys like you and me are trying to keep it alive. It's not
it's keeping itself alive, but it's in its own way, and who knows what will happen in the future. And again, this wonderful cross fertilization from musics all around the world that the internet really does facilitate.
Yeah, that the paradox you spoke of, that we had these different regional jazzes, West Coast, East Coast, Kansas City. Internet breaks all that down.
Yeah.
Anybody can
Yeah.
Get influenced by any region they want to.
Yeah.
Japanese, African. I got records from Ethiopian jazz, and
Yeah.
West African jazz, and Polish jazz.
Yeah.
There's so much out there.
Yeah.
Do any of the viewers here have a question they want to throw on screen? Because we're going to get ready to wrap it up pretty soon here. I'll give another shout out to the book while I peruse the comments. But James Kaplan's new book out on Penguin
Press.
Penguin Press, major publisher, major writer, wonderful writer. We have some real idiotic people in the comments here. I'm going to have to delete, and I don't have time to fix all this stuff.
We have trolls, Greg. Do we have trolls?
I have trolls, and
if anybody has, is there anything interestingly critical being said in the comments?
I've put them all on screen when someone had something interesting to say. What's this one? Jazz Bums Mics. Let's see. We don't need to be negative.
I'm not being negative. I'm being positive.
No,
I love
no one's being negative. I think the negativity is that the downfall of jazz. Remember, the jazz age was 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was the popular music in the country of the day. And now it's 2% of record sales.
Yeah.
And you walk down the street.
Downfall, yeah. I guess you can arguably say downfall.
It's a niche.
I prefer to say contraction. Contraction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in the title of your book, The End of the Empire.
Yeah.
The Lost Empire of Cool.
Yeah.
To me, that's the third act of the book. Is all good things must come to an end. The three men are not here anymore. They all died, maybe early, maybe because of their own behavior, but that's the way life goes, Yeah. Just like the rock and roll scene. Some people argue rock and roll is dead. There's no more Beatles. Anyway, we could beat that dead horse for a long time. Let's see. Here's somebody who might have an interesting comment. I don't know what the hell that means. That's a troll. Yeah. That's a troll. I'm flattered to have so many trolls.
A life. Trolls, get a life.
I'm flattered to have so many people think my channel is worth
trolling.
Yeah. And there's some real heavy duty racists apparently.
Really?
Yeah. That they were describing the racial differences in jazz. I'm shocked. I'm sorry. I apologize on behalf of normal humans.
Racist, which direction? Which direction? Anti-white or anti-black?
There's some anti-black racist
wow
morons coming up in the channel here.
Wow.
I don't know those people. I don't know how they found me.
Wow.
The fact that I'm live, YouTube pushes out the algorithm. Live streams get kind of pushed up. That's why I like to. Okay, here's our actual question by an actual human. Got a next book in the hopper?
Yeah, I'm working on a next book for Penguin Press. I'm writing about two guys you may have heard of, John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
Shit, sorry.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
I've heard of them.
Yeah.
They're good.
Yeah.
And you started interviewing people? Maybe you can't tell us much.
No, I've interviewed many people, and
you're already well on your way.
Yeah, I'm well on my way. It's going to be a very different sort of book, not only because of the subject, but because I think of the style and presentation of the book. It is, listen, there have been a trillion books about the Beatles. Everybody knows everything. There are 10 jillion experts out there. But I don't think, it's hard for me to think of any book about these two, about the incredible relationship artistically and emotionally between these two geniuses. So I'm trying to say what I can about this this friendship, this frenemyship, this historically great collaboration. I think I just said the unique approach.
Yeah, your book about Miles Davis, etc., was warts and all, and I don't know if the Beatles
Oh
guys
no, there are lots of warts,
will
tons of
get into
warts. And an
that. Yeah,
answer to Mr. Shad again, just quickly, yes and yes and yes. Of course, I talk about Paul's relationship to trad jazz, and yes, in the 1920s and 30s, Jim McCartney, Paul's father, had a small jazz band in Liverpool. Jim Mack's Band, it was called. Jim Mack's Jazz Band.
I didn't know that Paul came from a musical family. I should have guessed
Very
it, but
musical, yeah.
I did not know. And maybe one last question: do you have a top three favorite Miles records?
Oh God, it's so hard to say. I
You
love,
can't, you
of
can't say
course,
"Kind of Blue" three
Kind of
times.
Blue has to, yeah, Kind of Blue, and A Feed to Kilimanjaro is another amazing one. And in a lot of ways, that was my entry point into jazz. It was I heard it, remember hearing it in a dorm room when everybody was playing rock and roll, and it was just so beautiful. And then this is not really a satisfying answer to the number three, but I love crazy about those prestige albums, the single word prestige albums, Workin', Steamin', Relaxin',
Right.
that Miles made. They're more rough and ready, more gnarly than the Columbia albums. There are outtakes, there's commentary, the musicians talking on the album. I love all that, and it's great playing.
And the interesting thing is, those were what we call contractual obligation records,
Yes, yeah,
where they walked into the studio, he threw down a chart, and he said, "Okay, and he made four or five of the greatest albums ever,
yeah,
with essentially, you could say no preparation, or you could say a lifetime of preparation.
yeah.
But I echo your, I can't pronounce it, Defile de Kilimanjaro. I mean,
Fee. Do I have to say it's
Fee,
fee, like Fee?
Frenchy,
Fee
French.
de Kilimanjaro.
That was
Yeah,
a series of that one and In a Silent Way, and
yeah.
what's the third one? Three in a row.
Very
I
beautiful,
agree with you
very
on that.
lyrical, very beautiful, quietly majestic.
Um, One topic I see I didn't hit upon. We don't have much time left. I want to wrap this up and not keep everybody too late. Um, the effect of Columbia Records marketing and promotion really did a fantastic job of bringing Miles' art into everybody's living room. And I really hadn't given a record company that much credit
George
before.
Avakian.
Yeah,
George
George
Avakian.
Avakian.
George
Yeah,
Avakian.
I'm going to say a
George
word
was a
about
great
him.
man, head of jazz at Columbia Records, was not interested in bebop, was not interested in Miles playing fast, saw Miles from the beginning as a great ballad player. And so
Mhm.
when he signs Miles after the 1955 Newport Jazz Festival, Avakian sets about producing great ballad albums with Miles Davis, and from this turns Miles into a star, a superstar, a national best-selling, wealthy jazz musician. Who can imagine such a thing?
With Ferraris and all
Yeah,
that stuff.
all that stuff.
Yeah, so I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually giving a compliment to a record company that's known for ripping off jazz musicians just as much as they're helping them. But
I
Columbia
think
did a
I
great
think we're
job.
I think worse than Columbia in that regard might have been Atlantic, but I don't want to go down that alley.
That's a topic for
Yeah,
another conversation, another
yeah.
book. We're right at the top of the hour. It's been a full hour of fantastic conversation with James Kaplan. His internet site is scrolling across the bottom. You can get this book on Amazon or wherever else you want to find the book.
And
Three
don't
Shades of.
forget your independent bookstores. Don't forget, wherever you can find them, they are precious. Keep them in business.
I guess they're still out there, aren't they?
Yeah, still
Forget
out
forget
there.
Amazon. Forget Amazon. Go to your local bookstore if you can find an independent bookstore.
Yeah,
Good point. Independent record companies, independent record stores, independent bookstores,
you bet.
trying to keep non-corporate media alive here. Uh, One last comment. What is he talking about? Okay, it's a record. We'll have to go check out. The
Slim
Jazz
Galliard.
Bums.
Slim Galliard.
Oh, Slim. Yeah, I love
Yeah,
Slim. Slim.
Yeah.
Slim was one of the
Slim
only
and
people
Slam.
who.
Slim and Slam.
I have their original 78s here somewhere. Do I have it? Yeah, I'm going to show you this. This is beautiful. Original 1940s 78 RPM.
Wowie.
Slim and Slam
Hoot.
opera in Voot.
Hoot. Yeah.
I
That
don't think
was,
anybody
jazz had
remembers
its own
these guys.
language.
Yeah, Voot Vooty,
Yeah.
Mick Vooty.
Yeah.
Yeah, Slim. Someone needs to do a documentary about him. And Jazz Bums Mike, there's a channel that might invite you on because that's a great channel that does live streaming every, what is it, Thursday?
Cool.
And they just talk about jazz and they have
Cool.
100 or plus viewers.
Hi,
So
Jazz
guys,
Bums.
we're gonna sign off now that everybody's here and getting talkative. I gotta like get in the car and go to work now. Okay.
Yeah, me too. I got to get on my horse and go to work. There was a comment briefly flashed down there, and yes, I agree with it. Bill Charlap, certainly. Charles Lloyd is still getting it done. Absolutely worth seeing live.
We just saw Charles Lloyd on his 85th birthday. This could go on forever, but I can't let it, even though we would love to. Guys, I'm going to cut off our viewers and I'll say goodbye to James offline. So guys, again, thank you to James for joining us. It's been a very successful discussion. And I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. All right.
Thanks for having me, Greg. It's great being here.
Thank you. And